Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Fin TV. Today, we're joined by a special guest who is Wayne Rothman. He is VP of Partnerships and External Supply Chain at Janssen Pharmaceuticals. Wayne, thank you so much for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your journey so far, and also, maybe why you're in front of such a lovely view.
Yeah, so the view back there is my home country, South Africa, and that's Cape Town, where I spent a lot of my early career life at. And, just a bit of background for me. So entrepreneur by heart. So I've launched and sold a few companies, including an online retailer in Africa. But most of my career I've spent in logistics and supply chain. So I started off really basically in a warehouse, packing boxes. And work my way through every function within the supply chain. So over the years, been in every role, across the SCORE model, so plan, source, make, and deliver. It's been a good first part of my career in Africa for companies like Pfizer and Mondelez. And the last 12 years, I've been in Switzerland working for Johnson & Johnson, and in pretty much every role you can think of. And currently looking after partnerships and external suppliers. So that's everything related to our pharmaceuticals business and biologics and small molecule manufacturing that we don't make internally.
So you've seen everything from the supply chain function, you said. Okay, so I'm going to throw you at the first question, which is going to be about how you think you've seen the industry evolve, or the role of a supply chain person evolve in your time in this field.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've seen it evolve almost function by function. So within the supply chain, right? So I think at first started off everything was very transactional when I started. So supply chain was there to get a box to the customer. Very little value add in terms of the chain. I think we started to see that evolve, and then distribution started becoming a bit of an enabler and bringing value. So, you saw companies really changing some distribution models, which you see today, right? If you look at Amazon and these type of companies, really the advantage is the last mile, right? So you can see that evolve quite fundamentally. I think, when you look at planning, planning has evolved significantly over the years from a function that kind of planned the boxes to really a function now that's integrated very well with commercial and supply chain and seen as a value add, right? And driving, both top line and bottom line growth for the organizations. And, procurement came a little bit later. So, when I joined procurement, very transactional in the beginning, but, very much become, strategic sourcing. Out of procurement arms, you start getting innovation and other, huge top line growth drivers into the organization. So over these 20 odd years that I've been in supply chain, I've seen a major evolution of supply chain as a transactional sort of enabler to supply chain actually being a core part of top, bottom line growth for an organization. And some companies are just total supply chain organizations like Amazon, right? So that evolution's been massive, yeah.
What do you think was the reason behind this? I mean, do you think it has anything to do with consumer-driven demand, or the way that we've changed as shoppers? What are the levers behind this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I do think it's very much evolves around obviously big data, right, and also choice. So if you look at whether it's a patient or a consumer, the customer experience, if you look 15 years ago, was not really on any dialogue, right? It was, we make a product, it's a good product, right? And somebody's going to buy it. And if you market well enough, you're going to get it, the sale. I think that whole culture has changed fundamentally, particularly around choice. And, again, I refer to, online retail as one of the drivers here. But customer experience, I think, has been one of the biggest drivers for this change. People have choice. There's a lot of competition out there. And I think, trying to enable that customer experience, which actually drives demand, is been quite a big focus change. So, from a very marketing-driven organization, TV ads and so on, right, to a digital world where customers have choice. There's a lot of information on product, and it's now really about how do you get a customer to choose your product versus just having a good product, right? Yeah. And I think that's been a big fundamental shift as well.
So I think online retail has really had an impact on the way that we shop, the way that we demand certain things from the companies that we engage with. Where do you think this is going to go? I mean, what kind of future are we heading into? Obviously, there's the pre-COVID, post-COVID future, so there's that to consider.
Yeah.
But where do you think we're headed?
Yeah, I think, again, and it's focused on customer experience, right? So I think, the traditional approach of just having a product or an SKU that you can sell that people like, great. Online has shifted that a lot. There's more choice. But I think the experience around the product, so as we look at digital enablement, the experience around the product, the services around the product start becoming fundamentally more important. So I do think that evolution is going to grow. There's a reason why you have things like subscribe and save. There's a reason why there's software built around toothbrushes and everything else, right? So I believe this is going to happen even more so in consumer FMCG environment, but also in the pharmaceuticals environment, which I'm in today. So that evolution for sure is going to hit all aspects of categories that you play in.
So do you think that there are companies that are embracing that kind of thinking versus do you think that there's still other companies, again, not looking for specifics I'm looking in general, that sort of are still in the traditional supply chain model? I have a product, I sell a product.
Yeah, this is a great question. And if you look at what's really disrupting the market, it's the small players, right? Look at a company like Shopify, right? So Shopify is growing exceptionally today because small companies or independent businesses are actually getting massive traction. So I think the real challenges around the smaller companies are very focused on their customers compared to a big corporate. Big corporations are trying, right? So I see some pockets where some companies have really succeeded in certain categories, but it's taking much longer. So the real competition and the real learning is actually coming from the smaller players out there. If you look at even, at some of the trends online, you'll see that brands you never knew existed, right, are suddenly becoming massive brands because they, again, master the customer experience. So I think there's a lot of efforts. I would not say that I see any particular big, blue chip company that has truly mastered this across the breadth of the organizations. So this is a big challenge, and it's a cultural part to it, but also speed, right?
Well, it's funny because I was going to just talk to you about that in terms of the cultural element, the mindset. How important is it to have a corporate culture that understands supply chain as a key core focus of the business versus it being a cost center?
Yeah, I think to be honest, I think a lot of companies have kind of gotten past that, right? There's a big realization that supply chain is a massive enabler other than just a balance sheet and cost center, right? So I think most companies, at least that are mature enough in the space, have kind of overcome that hurdle. The bigger challenge is how do you change the culture, right, across thousands of people, across multiple functions, working together, because digital transformation and being close to the customer and understanding the customer experience is not that easy, right? So some functions are very far away. You've got old IT infrastructure and a mindset around sort of big ERP versus this plug and play and data centric strategies, right? So I think that's a big barrier now, right? So it's less about the strategy of the CEOs. I think most CEOs have kind of cottoned on that this needs to change rapidly. It's really how do you drive that culture, right, and that mindset through the organizations. And that's
you've just hit on the topic that I was about to bring up, which is digital transformation. I mean, pre-COVID, we were spending a great deal of time addressing that topic. What does it mean? What does it mean? Because it means different things to different people. How do you implement it? What's realistic? Et cetera. The biggest thing I always focus on is that digital transformation isn't just about adopting new technology. It's about having the kind of digital IQ within the business, the digital mindset in the business to make sure that everything is, that you take everybody with you. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think, I have a term I coined, which is called digital dexterity, right?
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, it's a great term because that's just the reality, right? We don't expect, everybody to be masters of, algorithms and data scientists. However, there needs to be this understanding that there's a role to play for data scientists. It's a much bigger role than it's ever been before. Functional knowledge is still extremely important, and I think this is what people forget, right? You can come in with really cool tools and load in a whole lot of data scientists, but if you lose that functional depth, you also don't find the right solutions. So I think the magic really lies in the combination of, having the balance between, the technical understanding of data scientists, the technical understanding of the functional knowledge, and then, truly understanding what does it mean, right? So is it just about creating tools and tool sets? So the answer is no, right? It's entire workflows. It's really understanding what value and starting with a problem to solve, right? And working backwards from that. And I think this is where a lot of failure comes, where, everyone tries to put in the cool Ferrari toys, but not really understanding what problems they're trying to solve. And, starting with the problem that you're trying to solve and solving those problems through data science and big data and I'd say more digital type of approaches, that's when you start, getting good wins and you can start scaling up across your organization. But that's kind of where it needs to start. And I think, a lot of companies try and do, the whole thing and change the whole lot with tools and loading data scientists, and that doesn't change culture. The culture changes when people see the real benefit, see it less of a threat, right? And see as it enabling, them to do more value-added activities. And that's when you start, driving this cultural shift in the organization. And it needs to be very purposeful. Yeah.
Well, as you say, you've got to start with what problem are you trying to solve? If you demonstrate to the people that you're, within your business that you actually help them solve a problem, then you take them with you, and the cultural element changes, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Let's talk tech for a second. Is there any technology that's out there that excites you, that you think is interesting, that you think is maybe going to be a game changer for businesses?
There's a lot, right? So, depending on where you're looking, if you're looking at robotic surgery, which J&J plays, and if you start looking at sensors, right, and sensors, I think is changing a lot. So, think of track and trace, right? Think of sensors on equipment and machinery. This is changing the game entirely. And I think you're going to start seeing much more of that embedded in. So, today you could almost have a consumption-driven model where, you have a bottle that senses, how full it is, and that can, trigger replenishment to the house. So I think, these are business models that are going to start, coming into play very, very soon, for sure. There's a little bit of that already, right? If you look at online retail, where it kind of predicts how often you order a certain item, and you can get this every week, or it triggers it. But it'll be much more data-driven in the future.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, all of this is underpinned by a whole lot of data, So I would imagine that if we get into more sensors, more track and trace, more things like wearable technology, et cetera, that tracks everything that we do, it's going to pull a bunch of data. What kind of teams do you think a supply chain leader needs to build for today and the future?
Yeah, no, and that's a great question. And, I'm a firm believer that, trying to do all things, right, kind of slows you down. So I always think it's good to, purposely build into your structure an innovation arm that has the space to experiment and to scout. And quite frankly, it's really looking at supply chain in a different way. Supply chain has been very traditional in many ways. But the reality is, scouting for innovation, finding new technologies, being an early adopter, to do sort of agile, proof of concepts, right? I think is really, really important, so that you can learn and be the first to get there. So for me, that's really where the magic lies, in being able to do those experimentations without these sort of big 2-3 year projects.
Because sorry to interrupt you, but the technology changes in 2-3 years. You can't embark on a 2-3 year ERP project to change your whole business. That might start. It might take 5 years from the moment that you conceptualize, the moment you deliver. Technology is moving way too fast, isn't it?
Exactly. And that's where, you know, this whole sort of ERP agnostic approach is quite important, right? So, you know, I'm a firm believer that you need to be agnostic of your ERP transactional systems, right? And you need to be able to plug and play and adapt, right? SaaS-based systems are great because, you know, they kind of evolve every day, right? Versus an out-of-the-box system. So, you know, this is the dynamics that you're playing with today. But you need to experiment, and you need to give the organization space to do that. The difficult part of that is making sure it's not so disconnected from the reality, right? That, you know, what they work on is not implementable. And that's really the balance that's hard to find. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you don't want moonshots of people sort of saying, we're going to go and we're going to, you know, cure cancer with this new technology. You want someone that will do a project and scale it up and so forth.
Yeah, on a small scale, right? To experiment in a small part of the business with new concepts and technologies, but starting with a problem to solve, right?
Of course. And so again, let's expand on this team stuff. I mean, do you think teams will need to have more data scientists in them? Do you think that there'll be people that will have to have a better understanding of digital technology moving forward?
Yes. So again, digital dexterity, like I said, is for me a critical component. So the functional knowledge, or whoever sits with the functional knowledge, would need to have that digital dexterity. So understand the language, right? Then, you know, coupled with the data scientists that can understand how to execute that and build the algorithms. You know, because think about this, right? In the future, a competitive advantage may actually be the algorithm that you're using. You know, so that could be your differentiator in the supply chain. So that combination of the functional knowledge leader who's got the digital dexterity that can understand the data scientist, and a data scientist that has built some competencies on the functional knowledge is a magic sort of combination. That's hard to do, to be quite honest.
I would also add to that probably a supportive management board that understands the need for having that kind, you know, that the value of data, you know. Would you agree?
I would totally agree, right? If it's not supported from the top, you're not going to get anywhere, right? So, you know, culturally, the only way you can drive a culture really is, you know, top down and bottoms up, right? So, you know, it's really, really important to have that direction, and, you know, from the top to give that leeway to allow people to experiment, but fail fast, right? And, you know, and there should also be this acceptance of failure. You know, I would say not irresponsible failure, but failing fast on your sort of proof of concept level, so that you can move on and try something different. But there needs to be this cultural change, and that can only be, that breathing space can only be given if you truly, you know, have your leadership, right, driving that culture.
What do you think about hiring people from diverse backgrounds in order to bring a different type of thinking to your team?
So diversity for me is a very passionate topic, right, for me. Absolutely. I mean, it's proven over and over again that diversity drives innovation. And diversity drives value. So I'm a firm believer in having diverse groups. I'm not just talking about gender, I'm talking about, you know, diversity in all aspects. I'm an absolute firm believer, and I've seen it for real, right? So, you know, in my previous roles, for sure, when I hire people, it was specific, you know, bringing people out of Amazon, bringing people out of very different industries, even compared to healthcare, to help us, you know, challenge the internal organization and bring competencies in and challenge the way we think. So, you know, it's a critical component to unlocking the real value.
And how do you, you know, these days attract people to supply chain, which in my opinion, I think we have a bit of an image issue. You know, I think supply chain is just still seen as a back office function. Maybe now everybody's talking about supply chain, that might change. But previously, I mean, how many kids in high school were hearing about a potential, you know, you should go into supply chain. That's a great role. So I guess I've got two questions. How do you attract talent, and how did you get into supply chain?
Yeah. So I think two things. One is supply chain need to do a much better job of marketing themselves, right? So I'm a big advocate of, you know, in supply chain, it's good actually to have somebody who knows how to market, because supply chain typically focuses on, you know, how to get things done, right? So that's a big component of you know, creating I'd say a marketable organization. And we spend a lot of time on that in my groups. And, you know, attracting talents, you know, I'm very fortunate to work for a company that has a credo. And, you know, the credo is an amazing document, right, that drives our culture. And people want to work for that type, right? They want to work in life sciences and bring value to patients and humanity. So from that perspective, there's a lot of marketing, you know, that you can do. But it's also can be an exciting place. So a lot of, you know, when we've recruited, I'd say, really great talent from other organizations, not just in healthcare, a lot of it's been around the inspirational vision, right? People don't want to come in and say, hey, I'm going to do order management, right? And that's where digital comes to play, because if you look at your sort of millennials and your younger generations, they don't want to come in and do order management and transact. You know, that stuff should be done automatically, right? What they want to see is, you know, how much value can I bring? How do I bring value to society? You know, what is my contribution, right? And that is something supply chain often undersells itself on. And that's why, again, it's so important to do the digital transformation so we can get people working on important but more exciting things than, you know, just transactions and, you know, managing orders across the chain.
Yeah, if you
There
think
were two
about it,
questions. I
supply chain.
answered one. I can't remember.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was just gonna say, you're right. How did you get into supply chain?
So for me, it was, yeah, it's quite an interesting story, because I was actually going to go to the Air Force to be a pilot. And in between, you know, having done the entrance course for the Air Force, I actually started working logistics as a temp. That's how I got in. I think how did I stay? It was really the value that I saw could bring. So, you know, I've been involved with IT for a long time. So even in my younger days, I was, you know, developing software, and I saw the impact that, you know, I could bring into supply chain. So that motivated me a lot. It really solidified when I had my own business in online retail many years ago. So before Amazon was really big, and that really showed me the competitive advantage, right, through really managing your last mile to the customer, and that got me totally hooked. Yeah.
That got you hooked. Well, see, that's interesting. That's what I was going to say. I do think the supply chain has a bit of an image issue. It's always been about moving boxes around some warehouse somewhere.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. If you're going to attract people into this space, you need to talk to them about all the innovation that's happening in supply chain right now. So there's some very exciting things happening, like you say, with robotics, sensors, track and trace. I mean, advanced planning, you know, machine learning, AI. That really is exciting stuff. But equally, and I think more importantly, it's about the impact that they can make on the world. Whether that is getting medicine to a different part of the world, whether it is even getting clothes to a different part of the world, or helping to build a car. So that leads us to, I guess, the great big elephant in the room, the COVID situation that we've got right now, the pandemic. Supply chain has never been seen as more important than it is today. There's a really big impact that supply chain can have today in the world, which I imagine you can see. What kind of opportunities do you think can come out of this pandemic? Again, not to downplay the horrible nature of what's going on and the tragedy and the death and so forth, but do you think there are opportunities moving forward for supply chain professionals?
Yeah, I mean, we'll take the most basic point, right? I think one thing that the situation has showed us is that, you know, mobility and where you sit, let's just take outside of manufacturing operations, but is less important than everyone thought it was, right? So I think the adoption of technology, like we're using Zoom right now, has accelerated extremely quickly, right? Because of the situation. It's forced us to work in a totally different way. So I think from that aspect, already there's a huge impact. I don't believe it'll go away. And I believe that'll kind of become a new norm for businesses and supply chain, right? In terms of, you know, it actually doesn't, you know, sitting anywhere in the world, you can actually still run, you know, multi-billion-dollar company, right? So I think that's been a huge observation. The other one is, for sure, it's going to start accelerating what I call transparency, supply chain transparency. So if you think about it, I look after hundreds of factories around the world. And if you think about it, some of the most important information is, hey, can they do their shifts, right? Is there an outbreak in the site? How do we keep on tabs on this? What's happening with logistics in those markets? So I think transparency in terms of the pulse of your chain and the lag, right, are two things that will significantly change, because you can clearly see that, okay, you can put people on it now, but you can clearly see that, the horizontal integration, which is what I call it, is absolutely critical, right? When something like this happens, you want to be able to have that full transparency across your chain very, very quickly. So horizontal integration, I believe, will be accelerated significantly, because now you can really justify, right, that it's kind of important, right, to be able to get a pulse, not a month later, but on the day of what's happening across your entire network.
Because you can't be there to see it. So there's been there's been a paradigm shift, hasn't there? We now are accepting the ability to work from home. The future of work looks a bit different. I think I spoke with someone the other day who said, until now, we never would have questioned the whole, I have to go to work, I have to be in this office by this point, which is what we did, what we've done for generations. Yeah. And now that's not possible, so we're adapting. So it's changed the paradigm, which has then given us this whole idea, as you say, horizontal integration, supply chain transparency.
I'll give you another example. Sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Yeah, and another example would be, virtual site tours, right? So, business doesn't stop, right? We still have to assess sites. There's work on vaccines. There's all kinds of things happening. And, you suddenly realize that, hey, your Google Glasses virtual plant tours, can actually work, right? You can actually be engaged with the site without being there, and, be there digitally, if you want to put it that way, right? So, remotely. So, that's another big dynamic that's changed. There's also a downside though, right? So we can talk about that maybe after you.
Well, of course, because, there is no replacement for sitting down, having lunch with someone that is managing your site and really getting to know them. You don't get that in a call, in a digital call. I get that. I think one of the things that I talk about, because people say to me, oh, when are you going to bring back the live events? And I think to myself, well, listen, digital events are not going to replace live events. There still is going to be the need to, sit down with someone, meet them eye to eye, talk about stuff that isn't just related to let's get down to business. But equally, we don't have that opportunity now. So therefore, we've got to make do with what we've got. So I think, in my humble opinion, that the future looks like a bit more of a hybrid of combination of digital as well as physical presence. Would you agree?
I agree. And it is a combination and a balance, right? So, again, one of the downsides is, there's sometimes it is hard for particularly, people that are single or alone, being at home, so there's this other dynamic around health that we shouldn't forget, right? Which is, it's great, and for sure things are going to change, but it's always, how do we find the right balance to your point, right? Because, you still need to get out and have a healthy mind, and these are things that sometimes can get lost in the excitement, right, of being totally virtual.
Yeah. What do you think about the possibility? I mean, now that we've got an opportunity to perhaps maybe even redesign supply chain, redesign business models, what about more sustainable business models? I mean, look at it, we're not traveling as much. So do you think that there's an opportunity here for supply chain leaders to help redesign a more sustainable business model?
I think that's automatically going to happen, right? So for sure, I think this sort of travel culture, right, is going to change dramatically. It'll still happen, but like you said, it's going to be a balance of virtual and physical, much more balanced than before. Big events, until there's a vaccine, I doubt they're going to even allow big events, right? So, this will definitely change the way, corporate travel works, engagement, like I gave the Google Glass example. You don't have to physically be at the site from day one. You might want to validate what you've seen, but there's for sure going to be a much more balance between the virtual approach and the physical presence.
And insofar as how you and your teams are adjusting to this pandemic at the moment. I'm sure, like everyone else, you've gone through phases. The first phase of, oh my goodness, shock, what are we going to do, panic. Second phase of, okay, let's get back to, we know how to fix things. And then I think we're in the third phase of, okay, now what does the future hold? What does the new normal start to look like? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think in the beginning, obviously, it was a big shock, right? So, in the beginning, also, like I mentioned, you didn't have all the data available, and you had to kind of very quickly develop some key processes. But for sure, now it is, what is the new normal going to look like? And, what does it look like prior to a vaccine, right? What does it look like after a vaccine? And, we're looking at all those aspects, including policies around open desk environments and all this kind of stuff, virtual work. So for sure that is being worked on, and that's a big topic within the teams, right?
Mm-hmm. And one of the other things that I've heard from other people is that because now so many people are talking about supply chain, I mean, it really genuinely is a topic of conversation in the news. I've never seen it on the news so often. It's elevated the profile. Do you think that this also gives an opportunity for the supply chain leader to emerge as a bigger part of a business?
I think it'll accelerate that journey. I think that journey's really started a few years ago. I mean, look at Tim Cook, right? I mean, he came out of supply chain, right? And so I think there's a lot of examples where, supply chain have been feeding CEOs for the last few years. But I do believe that the ability to orchestrate is a fundamental skill that sits in supply chain. And, orchestration is kind of the new leader, skill that's needed. So I do believe that supply chain's role, right, in terms of feeding leadership, for sure, will gain even more traction now. I mean, the reality is supply chain has kept a lot running, right, in the background amidst pretty much impossible situations. Borders closing, staff not being able to get to work. There's tons of things that supply chains enable very rapidly to keep the businesses running.
Well, I think it speaks to the nature of the supply chain function. The supply chain leaders are pretty agile and able to adapt to crisis, probably even unprecedented crisis like this. What do you see, if any, challenges or roadblocks down the line?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at, I'd say the geopolitical situation, I think is going to be a challenge, because it does change the dynamics. So how quickly, do you really need to have a dual source approach where you thought it was okay, single source, right? Where do you have, some of your critical component supply? Because, if you look at countries like India, the logistics shut down, right, for quite a while. So how do you balance that risk? I think so. Risk management, I think, is going to be very much a key on the cards. And probably a little bit more funding associated to risk management will come out after this, for sure. So I think that's one of the bigger changes that I think we'll start seeing.
Do you think that some of the lessons learned from this pandemic, and we're still learning every day and we'll continue learning for a little bit, but do you think that we'll go back to normal, or, the pre-COVID world, or will we actually learn some of these lessons?
Yeah, I don't, who knows what the future holds, right? But I don't believe it'll go back to normal. So because I do think, like I said, until a vaccine is available, I don't think any country is truly going to unlock all, right?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, the sheer cost, right, of shutting down already has been massive across the world. So I don't think there is such a thing as going back to normal. I think you can kind of call it the new normal, where it'll be this balance that we discussed earlier, right? So, and policies change, right? So, how you have meetings, how you handle hygiene, how your factory works, right? In terms of number of people that can be in a room and all these kind of things. That's going to change. And we have to be ready for that. And that's not just going to be a choice. A lot of it's also going to be legislation that I think starts coming through to drive this. Yeah.
What would you say to people that perhaps have not embraced digital transformation as much as they should have pre-COVID? Do you think that the time is now to act?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say probably really learn a hard lesson, right? That, not having data and not having transparency, I think, the companies that were not able to get visibility quick enough, for sure would have had logistics, disrupted somewhere along the line, right? And their business disrupted. So I think it's a good lesson that, you cannot be idle for too long on this topic. So I do believe that there'll be an acceleration of that journey. For companies that haven't embraced it already, yeah.
Yeah, I think, I totally agree with you. I think that just probably people were daunted by the task of digital transformation. It seemed like such a big thing to do. But if you do it like you say, which is find a problem, try to solve it, scale up from there, or proof concept, scale it from there. Lastly, what advice would you give to supply chain leaders today that are in the thick of it to build a resilient supply chain down the line?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a loaded question, right? But
it is, isn't it?
but I think the first one I want to give is be bold, right? I think supply chain should not undersell itself, and should also spend more time marketing what they do and accomplish, and see themselves as talent that has a combination of, business acumen, logistics, rapid decision making, these kind of things. So just make sure that supply chain is represented well. And I think work on your marketing story, right, to your commercial partners so that you can justify, really the role. And I think that's not done enough, as we discussed earlier, but I think that's an important part. I think now's a good time, right, where, I think a lot of companies realize without our operations running, we don't have a sale, right? We potentially put patients at risk, depending on what sector you're playing in. And I think it's a good time to escalate and to elevate supply chains visibility and capability so that we can address, the broader investments that will be needed to improve.
And then I would add to that something that you said at the beginning, which is the focus on the customer. I think companies that really embrace that and focus on the customer and work backwards are at an advantage.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Yeah. I mean, the reality is if you're not starting with your customer and you're investing, you're probably wasting a lot of dollars, because if you're investing in things that are not going to differentiate anything with the customer or improve the experience, you're only investing in yourself, right? So that's another great piece of advice. Don't invest on what you think is right. Start with the customer, understand the problem that you're going to solve for the customer, and then invest, because that's where you're going to get the value.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you for being part of FinTV, being part of this session. Hopefully we'll see you again soon, and stay safe. So thank you very much, Wayne. I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. For those of you watching, stay tuned for the next episode.